Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you so much, colleagues, for coming to the talk. So, I don't know why the font has changed, but anyway, things happen. So, so that's about my outline of my talk today. So I'll talk a bit about, the paths that I was trying to unravel when I was carrying out this research, as Julia was explaining earlier. And then of course, this is still work in progress, but for this talk, I didn't want to go into these theoretical debates about, sharp power, soft power, but I'll just say some brief remarks about this concept of sharp power and probably why I'm working to explore its relevance and also even to challenge it. And then the main part, I'll then look at some of the evidence in the field in terms of China's investment in African parliament buildings. And then I'll draw some reflections from that. And then thereafter, we're going to engage in a discussion. So let me start with a story. On the 26th of May 2010, at 2:05 in the afternoon, members of parliament in Malawi sat down to debate President Bingu wa Mutharika's State of the Nation address, which had been delivered the previous Friday to coincide with the inauguration of the Chinese government-funded new parliament building complex. So this is the one of the aspects of the complex. But to give you a broader visual image of the parliament complex, it consists of a reception office at the main entrance gate, a mini stadium complex abutting Greek-style colonnades, and the main building that you see here on the screen. The debate chamber is the centerpiece of the building. It actually covers 1,256 square meters, and it has 282 fitted seats for members of parliament, and an upper floor gallery for visitors. The debate chamber, you see this, is kept with a dome, which is the largest in Lilongwe, Malawi's capital city. So in preambles to their floor speeches, parliamentarians from across the political divide were gushing in their appraisal of the building. So let's hear from some of the members of parliament. So the then ruling Democratic Progressive MP for Karonga South, Honorable Muntali, started the ball rolling by congratulating President Mutharika, open quote, for making it possible that the new parliament building is really built, and I am among the first members of parliament to occupy it. This will always keep my memories fresh in future, end of quote. Not to be outdone, Honorable Chitete from Chinji Northeast, from the then official opposition Malawi Congress Party, also weighed in. Open quote, thank you, Mr. First Deputy Speaker, sir, for recognizing me to make my contribution to this unique, unforgettable, and remarkable meeting of Parliament. This magnificent Parliament building reminds me of that of King Solomon in the Bible, which was built for the Lord, but this one is constructed for honorable members like you and me. Glory be to God, close quote. So, this Chinese government-funded and constructed parliament building, which so enchanted the Malawi parliamentarians, was not actually an isolated act of benevolence. It is part of a larger phenomenon in Africa where China has constructed parliament buildings, about 15 parliament buildings for African countries. So Three questions actually emerge from the story, which constitute the puzzle. And when read together, like it constitutes the puzzle. So the first one is, why will China, a single-party communist regime, fund the construction and maintenance of parliament, of buildings that house multi-party liberal democratic aspirational institutions? So that's number one. The second one is, following from the first, what's in it for China? Especially when we consider the financing model. So China finances the construction of these permanently built structures through 100% grants and not as concessionary loans as they usually do for other bigger infrastructure projects. And the third question is, why do ruling elites in Africa acquiesce to receiving as gifts such symbolic buildings that are ultimately tied to national identity? For instance, the cost of these buildings is not too expensive. If you look at the example of Malawi that you spoke about, that building cost 50 million US dollars. This is money that even low-income African countries can easily raise to construct their own parliament buildings. So to make a sense of the questions I've just outlined, this talk focuses on how these building projects were proposed, who proposed them and carried out, and how the building projects were carried out, and also focuses on the politics and implications of their architectural design and construction, and by extension, their maintenance. We will also engage with how the buildings, once completed, are used and perceived. Because I believe that understanding this has a domino effect in providing clarity on the three questions I raised earlier. So from 2018 to July 2023, I conducted elite interviews. So I have some pictures here so that they're a proof of life that I was meeting, big people in government. So I conducted the elite interviews, and I also observed did the observations in the three different sites in Lesotho, in Malawi, and in Zimbabwe. I also conducted a focus group discussions with ordinary people who live and work around these buildings. And in total, I interviewed 80 elites in 3 countries, conducted 24 focus group discussions, and spent a minimum of 50 days in each parliament observing the workings of the buildings. I was also privileged to film inside and outside some of these buildings. So let's talk a bit about sharp power. Perspectives that have been advanced, to characterize China's expanding foray in the global south in general, and Africa in particular, range, from the outright critical that in China, in the global south literature, or in looking at China's foreign policy, it might be classified as dragon slayers. And then, or to the ultimate coddling, which is what some might call panda huggers. But given the focus on my understanding of China's involvement in domestic political institutions today, I will directly engage with a specific concept which was mooted around the time I began my research. And this concept, they call it sharp power. So sharp power, where does it come from? So it was introduced into academic circles in 2017 by the US non-governmental organization, the National Endowment for Democracy, as an appropriate description of China and other authoritarian states' use of mechanisms to, quote, pierce, penetrate, or perforate the political and information environments of targeted countries. Of course, NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, is a peculiar NGO. It's what some other scholars might call it a gongo, a government-owned NGO, because it was actually set up by an act of Congress, but it's an NGO. But today we won't talk about that. I talk about that in the paper that I'm developing. In other words, the description of sharp power indicates that China's engagement in target countries is aimed at puncturing or changing the political environment, possibly through promoting and enforcing illiberal values. And this is an argument that is really popular amongst scholars who work on this. So, and sharp power is ostensibly meant to distinguish what has generally been accepted as soft power, which is influence-building activities carried out by democracies, from those that are being implemented by authoritarian states, such as China. And again, the underlying rationale here is an attempt to classify soft power as being a positive tool to attract and persuade, to distinguish it from sharp power, which ostensibly distracts and manipulates. So sharp power is presented as having malevolent rather than benevolent designs. And this line of argument is popular in US academic circles, and it seems it's capturing the imagination of scholars that seek to understand China's expanding political engagement, such as what we're discussing today. So the running thread of sharp power theories is the projection of liberal values in the description of soft power. However, in rebutting this approach, I defer to Joseph Nye, who is the one who came up with this concept of soft power. At a speech delivered at Beijing University, probably was being nice or not, I don't know, in 2012, he said, he clarified that, open quote, soft power is not a form of idealism or liberalism. It is simply a form of power. It is one way of getting desired outcomes, close quote. So, in diagnosing the genesis of this misconception, Nye opines that perhaps it is because the concept of soft power is often embraced by ethically minded scholars and policymakers. However, soft power is a descriptive rather than a normative term. So the soft power, open quote, sorry, soft power is a descriptive rather than a normative concept, close quote. In other words, what Nye is actually telling us is that it's causing us to divest value-laden judgments when evaluating the nature and character of soft power or any form of power. It's something that I'm actually working on to understand, what I call power play. And I'm trying to draw from the literature on organizational behavior to understand how power works without necessarily putting values into it. But it's a story for another day. So this is significant if we look at it like this, because on this premise alone, sharp power loses a major source of its potence. Now, beyond the theoretical rebuttal, let's turn to my empirical findings and see whether the delivery of these Chinese government-funded parliament buildings in Africa fit within this framework of sharp power, perforating the political environment, manipulating rather than attracting. The answer is not really straightforward, but let's get into the nice bit about what I found. Now, as I said, that I want to focus on some aspects about, okay, where did these buildings come from? Who proposed these buildings? Funny enough, this picture, this is the only picture that is not my picture. credit to the Herald. The other pictures, I took them during the field work. So this is, the one with the scarf is President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, and then the other one is King Mswati of Eswatini, the only leader remaining standing. In fact, funny enough, he's sitting on top of that China sign. He's the only one in Africa who still is friends with Taiwan. Anyway, so these projects are proposed at the very top and are aligned to the identified needs of the recipient countries. Let's talk a few examples. So in Zimbabwe, for instance, the Chinese government announced its offer to fund and construct a new parliament building for Zimbabwe during President Xi Jinping's December 2015 visit to Zimbabwe, state visit to Zimbabwe. President Xi was actually en route to South Africa to co-chair the FOCAC summit alongside President Mugabe. President Mugabe then was, the late President Mugabe was the chairperson of the AU. Similarly, in Lesotho, this building was also offered as a gift to the Prime Minister, then Pakalita Mosisili, when he was on a state visit to China. And the last example, the Malawi Parliament building, was also offered as a package during the time when Malawi was switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to Malawi. And there's something about the significance of this idea of pitching them at the level of the head of state, because once it's done like that, this project then gain what is called national project status, and it then enables what I call in the book, forthcoming book, China to have carte blanche power in terms of implementing these projects. But this might look like some elite, game, elite deals, elite gifts. The actual story is that these buildings, they actually fulfill a desire for parliamentary space. So in the 3 countries I've studied, so these buildings, the new buildings donated by China, are the first purpose-built, parliamentary facilities. So you see the example that I put there on the screen. This is Malawi before, this new parliament building. So maybe let me just talk a bit about Malawi. So Malawi, the capital city, the seat of government during the colonial era used to be in a place called Zomba. It's a picturesque, town, or it's a city in the southern part of Malawi. And the parliament building there was constructed in the 1950s, and it was constructed for 30 members of parliament. But the Malawi parliament, after the end of the one-party state and multi-party politics in 1994, it grew to about 193 members of parliament. So it couldn't afford, it couldn't fit, these people. But then a decision was taken to take the Malawi parliament outside Zomba to bring it to Lilongwe, the new capital city. When it got here to Lilongwe, because Kamuzu Banda, the erstwhile dictator of Malawi, had constructed an ostentatious, palace, and so those multi-party presidents that came after Banda, they didn't want to use that facility. It looked like, it was a display of opulence. So they then decided to convert the state banquet room into a parliament chamber. But there were no facilities. The tea rooms were some makeshift committee rooms, but there were no facilities, for example, for offices. So this is why, like you see, the officials were in different places across the city. So quite difficult to run a parliament, across the city. And so, but another, motivation again, the first president after Kamuzu Banda, Pakili Muluzi, went out of power, 2-term limit. Then a new president came, Bingu Wamtarika, and as usually happens in African countries, usually there's an element of forgetting. There are now, Bingu wanted to use the palace, because now at least it was 10 years, people no longer are quite sensitive about the palace. And Bingu said, no, but that is a presidential palace. Then he started to go on this tirade. He said, I'm actually going to construct for you a parliament building. So parliament should not operate in State House. Actually, there the president should operate from State House. So it was a project that required, rather, that was fulfilling a specific need. You can say the same about Zimbabwe. You can say the same about Lesotho, but I don't want to belabor the point. So let's talk now about the politics of design. Some of you I know that, in terms of interested in the architecture part of it, like who designed the buildings. Before I talk about who designed the buildings, let me also mention something linking to what I just said about fulfilling a need. So one of the things that was happening, and this was a very important point for me to mention, in the early 2000s, they inspired or not inspired, but encouraged by Western donors, the UK included, UNDP and others. So there was this move to do some things called the parliamentary reforms. The buildings the countries that I studied, they follow, or rather they are, they have like, because they're British colonies, they have like, their parliamentary system is close to the Westminster. It's an adaptation of the Westminster parliamentary model. Not quite, but an adaptation of it. So there was this idea of reforming parliament. And what does reforming parliament mean? If you just look at the parliament here in the UK, so the idea was, no, parliament is not just a debate chamber. Parliament needs to have portfolio committees. So if you are going to have portfolio committees, you are going to need space to do these committees. Parliament needs, what do they need? Parliament needs, staff, because now that you have these portfolio committees, you need committee clerks. You need, people to do stuff. And also because the entrenchment of multi-party politics, which prior to 1990 was something like a dream, now to consolidate this, you need to ensure that there are offices for the leader of the opposition, the chief whips of parliament. You need to have a space to connect the executive to parliament, and you have something that you may call the budget office. So all this required, lots of space, right, for it to operationalize. And also, when there is space, there is the consolidation of the institution of parliament and the concomitant weakening of executive power, as it were. So this was like a model that was developed. But the Western donors forgot how to actually provide for the space. But even if they didn't, they forgot to provide for the space. The countries themselves came up with a program to build new parliament buildings, structures rather. And they had designs. But when China came into the picture, they wouldn't want to use the designs that had been developed. They wanted to insist on their own designs. It's another debate why they did that. Let's go to some examples again of the design. So let's start with Malawi. So in Malawi, The building is quite interesting. It was designed by a consortium of architects in Malawi, 3 companies. And this happened during the time of Taiwan, when Taiwan was still in place. And Taiwan funded, provided support in the tune of $5 million US for this project. And the building actually began, like it was like started, and it went up to first floor. Local architects, and then local companies, I'm saying in quotes because there are Portuguese companies that were now been domesticated into Malawi, and they're called Terraston and Deco. They are now known as a Malawian company, so local companies, right? So they started the building, but once diplomatic relations shifted, and China offered to construct the building, the local actors were removed from the project. The architects were requested to hand over every document pertaining to construction of the building. This included the construction drawings and specification that the government then passed on to the Chinese government for them to proceed with construction. And also, what's quite interesting is that the contribution of local architects has been expunged from the official Malawi government literature on the project. If you talk to anyone, they've even forgotten that they are Malawian architects. But I was lucky because I spoke to the guys that did this, and they showed me the prototypes and the pictures with bingo and doing all those kinds of things. So it's quite interesting, how like history sometimes, you say it doesn't have blank pages, but sometimes it does. Okay, last example, the Zimbabwe, building. So this is the new building that they did, the Chinese did, but let's talk about the design of this building. So the Chinese, this building design concept, I found out that it subtly appropriates aspects of intellectual work developed by local architects stretching way back from the 1980s. So on the 5th floor of the old Parliament building in central Harare sits a model of the Parliament building that was designed to be constructed at the Harare copy at some other different place, not this place. And the design was a product of local architects whose input started with a group called the Parliament Architects Group in the 1980s to Studio Arts and Pantish Architects in the 2000s. So the model shows the centrality of the Great Zimbabwe Monument. You see these are conical towers. If you have seen the Great Zimbabwe, you can see that where the motivation, rather the inspiration is coming from. So according to a former clerk of parliament, and this guy, he had been with the Parliament of Zimbabwe since independence, and then he became clerk of parliament for 30 years. So I interviewed him, and I was lucky to interview him. He's late now. And so may he so rest in peace. And so when he was taking me through this history, he then told me something that the Great Zimbabwe idea was actually suggested by the late Vice President Joshua Nkomo. And so this design used at Mount Hamden also foregrounds the Great Zimbabwe, as you see, and it bears striking resemblance to the previous models, but it does not acknowledge the prior work in the publicly available material. For example, Studio Arts that I mentioned and Pantish Architects are reported to be unhappy that elements of their design template, the one displayed in the old Parliament building I mentioned, were appropriated by the Chinese. They were eventually sidelined and expunged from government literature. So according to a retired permanent secretary, who is actually a business acquaintance of the two architects, Biggie Matiza, the late Biggie Matiza from Studio Arts, and Pantish from Pantish Architects. Pantish is he's a Yugoslav who came to Zimbabwe and is naturalized. So he says that, in open quote, when you go into their offices, they say this is our original design which the Chinese stole, close quote, sorry. Given the resemblance of the official Chinese design to the model I saw at the old Parliament building and the online versions of the Design at Studio Arts website, this narrative is credible. But holding the intellectual property argument constant, I consider this a China strategy of subtly making their design to be in sync with national imagination. So, if they had a building that doesn't resonate with national imagination, probably it will be problematic. So they played with this thing into that. So let me just end this bit of examples by mentioning that the design of the buildings, and I think architects would know better, it then informs the material specification. And so, which means that the Chinese contractors will then, be in charge of material specification and getting materials, and then doing the construction of the building. And then there are lots of things, but to focus the talk. So once the building is constructed, it also leads to another layer of maintenance. So it's a whole chain: design, construction, maintenance. And so by doing it this way and not following, the other stuff, so it shows that if the Chinese design it, they constructed it, and then also it will follow that they maintain it. Because we'll talk more when we do the question and answer if people are interested in some of the ways in which it was constructed in such a way that it is very difficult for non-Chinese contractors to understand the building fully. They might understand parts of it, but not in its entirety. So let's talk about, now rounding up, let's talk about how these buildings are used and perceived. So it's quite interesting. So I put these pictures. So you can see that these are these are landmark buildings. So they actually have transformed the urban scape. So outside, the politics of their construction design, these buildings are sort of some of the best buildings in these cities. And it depends, when you look at it as a building, it's looked at as a grand building that beautifies the place. I didn't you saw the Malawi one earlier. So when I was speaking in focus group discussions, some youths, young people were saying, every time I pass that building, I want to take a selfie. It's like I'm in America. I love it a lot, and also it is a sign that Malawi is developed, right? Even when I spoke to quite critical colleagues in civil society in Zimbabwe, they were initially saying, why did China construct it? But once it was constructed, they were saying, no, this building is nice. Actually, we're going to remove this ruling party, and then we're going to occupy this building and do the right things in this building. This is actually the right place to transform our country. So there is the positive bit about the building, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we now factor in, the broader politics about China, about the elites. You get other views, but generally there is a sense that the buildings are quite positive. Now, what about inside the buildings? How do they organize the space? So the buildings, as I said earlier, that there was no parliamentary space. Now, when I was observing the workings of the building over 50 days and talking to people, I realized that these buildings have enabled the creation of what I call a parliamentary ecosystem. What do I mean by parliamentary ecosystem? I mean the presence and maintenance of a network of public officials and representatives that work in a defined space, in close proximity to each other, specializing in parliamentary activities. And this probably in the literature on legislative institutionalization. So one of the things that people in that kind of literature speak about is the aspect of the routinization of these roles, and then what they call boundedness of the institution, separating it from the other. So the building itself creates this boundedness, but also inside it creates a level of routinization of parliamentary business. In a way, it's funny because while it was brought by elites, the presidents, you'd think that then it will support the president, but in a way, it's sort of like a building that is now consolidating parliamentary democracy in a way, because in numbers, the Parliament of Lesotho moved from having about 30-odd employees to over 110 employees. Also, there was a double figure increase from Malawi. Now there are about 200 and something employees. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the building caused this expansion, but I'm saying the building enabled this kind of expansion. And so you find that in a building, there are offices, the staff, more staff when I work on parliament, and then members of parliament, there are lounge, or these networking lounge areas where they meet to discuss. So there's this creation of what I call this parliamentary ecosystem, and it might mean that the building itself, these buildings themselves, have sort of planted this idea of, well, they are there and they are supposed to work. So, and in a funny way, so their offices, opposition leader's office. So even in countries like my own country, Zimbabwe, where the ruling party does not want opposition, but it can't do anything about it, it has to have those kinds of structures. So the days of one-party states, probably they are over. And in a funny way, it took a one-party state country to develop, to institutionalize multi-party democracy. It's weird, but it is what it is. Now, let's also draw on, I'm now landing. Let's now draw on what is it that we draw from the construction of this process, and maybe link it to the idea of sharp power that we just flagged earlier. So, but before I go there, I just want to explain the image there. So this image, you can see this is the anyone who wants to guess which parliament is this one? Anyone on the top there? From the three, Lesotho, Malawi. There's a giveaway. Yeah, there's a giveaway. Like yes, there's a giveaway. So it's Lesotho. So that building, you see this compound here. So that compound is called Bahlokomeli ba Parliament ya Lesotho. It literally means the caretakers of the new Lesotho parliament. So the Chinese contractors stay here, and they've been here since 2008. They don't go anywhere. They are caretakers of that parliament building. So whenever there's a problem, they just go downstairs and call the guys to fix the building. So because of the maintenance issue that I spoke about. So now that I've explained this, let me just go to 4 reflections that I have on this. So number 1, China is pushing its interests by building parliaments for African countries, as this enables it to build long-term and lasting relationships with political institutions in target countries. And note here that I said institutions rather than political personalities. This explains the focus on multi-party parliaments. But to gain access rather, they have to work through the ruling elites of the time and merge their interests with the idiosyncratic design of the African rulers. This denotes a circumspect strategy rather than a brazen perforating of the political environment as proposed by sharp power theory. So in other words, there's this idea of when they get into a space, they first of all find out how do things work here and how do we understand this. So I think sharp power theories underestimate the agency of beneficiary states or the target states, because things don't just happen like, because you are big and I'm small, you can just impose yourself. So you find that there's this nuanced way of engaging this, achieving its own objectives. Second point, the way it controls the design, construction, and maintenance of these buildings is indicative of the long game in the institution of parliament in particular, and in the diplomatic and political orbits of the beneficiary countries in general. So China wanted to make itself indispensable and to have a reason to stick around. This is why they negated the existing plans and came up and said, no, we're going to do it our way. But why would they do so? There's a bigger explanation, but just for this talk, the explanation is African parliaments, having transformed into multi-party forums, are the only place where one finds a country's dominant political factions of the time. So it is only in parliament where you find, it is more like the thermometer, the heartbeat of the state. Those ones who are ruling, those ones who are opposing, and the consolidation of electoral democracy, not in the way in which, this is the institution of Tom Young, not in the way in which the liberal state building project intended, because African states have put democracy with African characteristics. So multi-party democracy, then in the African way, you find the dominant factions there. So what better place to actually network than in those kinds of structures? Third, what about the argument of China's importation of its illiberal values and authoritarian institutions to fledgling democracies? Well, this is one argument that sharp power theories, particularly in American scholarship, nerds, circles. But evidence from its investment in African parliaments shows that China is not interested in perforating target countries' liberal democratic institutions. China seems to have understood the deep-rooted nature of these political and institutional arrangements in target countries. And instead of being a proverbial bull in a China shop, it is subtly establishing itself as a key player within these institutions. Note that it is neither keen to replace Western actors in these parliaments, nor is it interested in suggesting alternative governance models through rethinking or reimagining the parliamentary built environment. But this does not mean that they're an altruistic actor or a selfless actor. It means that it is seemingly achieving its objectives through subtle rather than sharp means. Lastly, what escapes many China in the Global South commentators is that China's investment in African parliaments has counterintuitively strengthened the parliamentary institutions in the beneficiary countries through providing these bespoke, purpose-built parliament buildings, which have enabled, one, the development and expansion of the parliamentary ecosystem, and two, magnified the socio-economic significance of the institution of parliament through the stature of these landmark buildings. It is that China has joined the bandwagon of parliamentary strengthening initiatives in African parliaments, but have done so using Chinese characteristics. Whereas Western donors are interested in shaping the content output of African parliaments. And here, to use the analogy of boxing, So the West here is keen to invest in the actual boxers so that they compete well. But China isn't bothered about the actual boxing players and matches. It is interested in being the guy who provides the venue. That way, it doesn't need to worry about losing or winning. Anyway, in conclusion, so back to our two members of parliament, Honorable Chitete and Honorable Muntali. We're gushing with praise, remember them in the introduction. So Honorable Chitete is no longer an MP. He was replaced by Honorable Zulu now in Mchinji North. Honorable Muntali was also outsmarted by another guy called Uchinzi Mkandawire in the 2019 elections. Also, Bingu Wamtarika, whom this gift was given to, is no more. Even Joyce Banda, who came after him and actually who negotiated this deal as foreign minister, is now retired. And Bingu's brother, Peter Wamtarika, became a one-term president. But the beat goes on. China and the building remain constant. China continues to stake its claim through ongoing maintenance of the building. Remember the dome, right? So the dome, it leaks like a sieve. So you see this construction work. I took this when I was doing field work. So every year when it's rainy season, the dome leaks, and the Chinese put up this thing and they fix the dome. And so through this annual mending of the dome, all members of parliament know of China's lacking presence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Irene. Brilliant. I'm going to open the floor to questions, but perhaps you could say something about why you think, whether you think soft power works better. If these buildings have been made, I mean, you've explained the particular way in which these buildings are made and maintained and so on, the relationship works. I love the boxing analogy, but I do wonder, how are they not soft, or is soft power an inappropriate way of understanding what's going on? And if it is, why? If the Americans had made these buildings, would that have been described as more as soft power? Why is it not useful, or perhaps it is useful in this case with the Chinese construction?
Okay, thank you, Julia. So there are two things. So in terms of what it is and how it is delivered. So in terms of the concept of what it is, right? This would qualify as a soft power because, these countries are wanting to be seen in favorable light. That's what soft power, the essence of soft power, right? So it will be that. But the American scholars led by Ned, the guys that came up with sharp power, they actually distinguish that, no, there is a cultural component which is not state-led, which characterizes soft power, the cultural aspect, but also, so in other words, they are saying this one is state-led, can't be soft power, it can't be soft power. They're also saying this one is not public diplomacy, because public diplomacy also, is part of, the retinue of soft power. So they say, because it is not that, then we have to find a new nomenclature to explain it. But Nye tells us that, no, in fact, soft power is not necessarily, it's not a normative concept, but the people who have popularized this idea of China can't have soft power, it's because they use normative values. So I'm saying it's very difficult to say, okay, to insist in soft power. So I'm saying even if it is like that, let's take the argument that it is not soft power. And this is qualified by Nye, actually. Let's go now to the aspect of how it's applied, because sharp power means this idea of imposition. So I then disagree again with this concept that, there is this brazen way of doing things. It is a lack of understanding of how these things work, and also a lack of respect for countries that engage with China, particularly in the global south. So that's why I'm saying if it's not sharp, so if it's not soft, then it is not sharp. What I see more is the subtle element, and here, just last point, I'm not saying China is a selfless actor. It is doing what big powers do. That's an understanding that is supposed to be there. China is doing what big powers do. But explaining it as sharp power misses the point, because it's failing to explain the phenomenon as it happens. Yeah. Yeah.
Any questions or comments?
Thank you for this really good stuff. I'm sure the book is going to be amazing. So I get why China, especially using what you ended on, the Nikito, I get why they keep the workers there, the maintenance workers there, to come and remind people of who gave you this bill. But I'm struggling to understand why the parliament is not having sort of local workers trained to learn to maintain and to break this. What's the motivation? Is it a funding thing? Is it like the Chinese state is paying the maintenance workers rather than the government's paying them? What's the motivation?
Thanks, Cook. That's actually a very interesting question, because let me use one example or two examples, quick two examples. Let me start with Lesotho. So in Lesotho, I went to this parliament library and I found a manual or something like that. They're saying that it was more like a manual of training local people, and there was a price to the manual. So when I was following up, like, so these Chinese wanted to be paid to do this, then I realized that it was not done, and I didn't get an explanation of why it was not done. But then I pushed further because I was interested in that question, what's happening here? Then I realized that in the Ministry of Development Cooperation, I'm not saying it, but the Development Aid Coordination, sorry. There's a unit that coordinates development aid, all the donors. So this ministry or this unit is the one that actually monitors people that are coming in from these other countries. And they told me that there's been no budget for, rather, they told me that there's no budget for employing locals to work there. But what has happened is that they've sort of split the responsibility. So they take care of the security of this place, right? They pay the security, they pay the electricity. This is the government of Lesotho. And then China then provides the equipment, right? And they do this through 3-year maintenance arrangements. Last example in Malawi. So in Malawi, the situation is quite different. There are actually 4 maintenance guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, in there. And I spoke to them. I did a focus group meeting. So there's an electrician, there's a carpenter, then there's a plumber, then there's another guy. I've forgotten this guy, what he does. So what they do, these guys, is whenever there's a problem, when there's a big electrical fault, it's written in Chinese. He goes and sees. He opens Google, and then if he's not happy, then he takes it upstairs, right? The plumbing guy, so when you walk around the building, it has got a funny smell. So the plumbing guy also has problems in fixing that thing, the thing. And so whenever they want to do their work, if it's the plumbing guy, he has to bring the electrician and the carpenter to be his assistants. So it's a very funny kind of arrangement, and it is because they say to me, the building has not yet been handed over to Parliament. So the building is owned by the government of Malawi, Minister of Public Works. So the Parliament of Malawi just does this small thing. So in other words, cut the long story short, there is a lot that goes on the maintenance. It's a research on its own. Watching those dynamics happen, it actually puts this thing of, this is why they wanted it to be done this way. They're not there for a short haul. It's a long range involvement.
Thank you, Ivy. It's a fascinating research. It reminded me a little bit of, I took a field trip, a group of students to Eritrea, where there was a new educational building just completed by the Chinese, and we were expected to do a presentation with an overhead projector, but all of the software was in Chinese, so the locals didn't know how to use any of the actual software in the building, but we had Chinese students with us, so we could overcome that problem on our particular visit. But my question to you was, I was at a book launch earlier this week on Parliament buildings, the architecture of politics in Europe, which was a global funded project at UCL, looking at the spatial arrangements in particular of Parliament buildings. You showed the interiors of the three case studies. One of the main theses of this book was that the spatial arrangements of different parliaments around Europe reflect the either written or unwritten constitutions and parliamentary processes and practices of their respective nations. Your point about this being an authoritarian, state-funded series of projects for democratic nations was an interesting point, and I wondered to what extent the spatial arrangements, the interiors, reflected the politics of those countries. How much research was done to decide whether they should be circular, or two should be horseshoe shaped and one was circular? And do they reflect the local political arrangements of those nations?
Yeah. Interesting. So, thank you for that question. So, yeah, that's also one thing that I was looking at, because the backstory is the colonial buildings that these new structures are replacing. They have these Westminster type, House of Commons type benches, right? This side opposite that side, but in an interesting way, this secular horseshoe format is not necessarily an invention of the Chinese there. It is actually, and if you look at, because how I try to analyze this, I looked at the Malawi Parliament building and the material that I got from the original architect, who told me that for them to do this, they had to do this kind of a wide tour. They went across the continent to observe other parliament buildings, and they produced this structure. This structure. So even the Chinese, when they say they designed this, they didn't do anything, right? And then this structure also, it sort of mimics what is there in Malawi, right? And there are many features, inside features, that you see here, that you see from the Malawi building. So I have a sense that Malawi building is sort of gave the Chinese a prototype, although it's different architectural firms, right? This one was done by the Zimbabwe one, done by the Beijing Institute for Design. I forget the Malawi one. So, and then the Lesotho one, it might also have been a function of the chamber, because the chamber, when it was being designed, it is the only place where Lesotho architects were managed to have their opinion, and it's designed in a wet. I don't know. Yeah, let me just show you. It's used as what is that? Yeah, you see this, this is a Lesotho traditional hat. And then so they used to have this, what they call pizzos, like people sit around. So they could be elements that come from the traditional or pre-colonial past, but it was a negation of the old Westminster system, which was using those parliamentary benches. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about the designs reflecting local aesthetic types? So that the round shape with the peaked top, and then you mentioned Great Zimbabwe, but then I think also the dome on the Malawi Parliament, does that have some sort of local resonance?
Yes. So the starting with the dome. So the dome is quite interesting. Talking to elites, they say it represents that leaking dome. It represents a granary, granary, warmth of Malawi. But when you talk to ordinary people, they say, no, these politicians are lying. It actually represents a begging bowl, right? So why did, so they append the dome. But there's imagination about how it actually feeds into the cultural aspects. The Mokorotlo hat, the one that I was just describing here. So this is a traditional Lesotho hat, and it's the only thing in that building that is really that looks local. And even you can see the building is plastered. Usually buildings in Lesotho are not plastered because of elements of weather. But there was an attempt to make it local. Finally, like I spoke about in the talk about the use of the Great Zimbabwe Monument. And the Great Zimbabwe Monument is actually speaking to a bigger thing in Zimbabwean politics. There's an imagination, imagination that harkens back to the colonial, not colonial, pre-colonial past of the Mutapa, the Great Zimbabwe, the empires of the past. Actually, our president, Zimbabwean president, his nickname, his friends call him Muno Mutapa, meaning like he's like king of the Mutapas, right? Even the seat of government is called the Muno Mutapa building. So them going here and setting up something like this. So the Chinese were also playing into the imagination of the local elites,
Right. My concern with the Chinese going into these African countries, imposing their design on a place like the parliament is concerning. But the problem is money, because these countries are poor. So they use money to shut them up and impose their design in this country. My problem is, as a writer and a lecturer and academic, what contribution have you managed to put into this? You say you are from Zimbabwe. The idea of imposing that sort of design in a parliament of your country is insulting. If I remember correctly, I think the local architects and the people involved in building design something for the parliament, how they want it to be. And then when the president or whoever, traveled to China, I don't know what they had together, and then came back and then abandoned the plan, and Chinese offered to build this parliament and insisted on doing it the way they wanted. In short, saying a beggar cannot be a chooser. Mm-hmm. It's an insult. What are the people doing allowing these sort of things to go on. It's wrong. So my question is actually directly to you. What are you doing to make sure that these people that run this country see straight through what is going on? The Chinese have done something like this in about more than 15 countries, if I'm correct.
Yep.
And they allow them to keep going on. It's good to help. Okay? It's good to create a stand of friendship for someone you think they don't have the money, then you offer the money, but at least you allow them to retain their culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for those questions, and they are deep, because you see, maybe let me start with the most difficult. We, as Africans, and also as African intellectuals, and as African people in general, we need to have a conversation about what is the place of Africa in the world. So we are coming from colonialism, of itself, which also, if you bring back the issues of slavery, there's lots of history. And the West and Africa has not had an equal relationship. It's in the language of, it's a horse and rider relationship, or it was a horse and rider relationship, even up to today. So with the unfolding shifts in geopolitics, the emergence of China. So China has created an alternative, because now we don't need to depend on the West alone, because this is why we're talking about Tom Young, the liberal state building project of the 90s, right? If you want this, do this way. You want this, do multi-party politics. This is the way, this is the way. But China's emergence, it has provided an alternative. So that's why the potence of the West to be a policeman in Africa has sort of reduced. But what it also created, it created this dynamic of a relationship between Africa and these new powers, in particular China, right? And the relationship itself is not structured in a very beneficial way to African states. And one of the reasons that is not done, just to mention this point and then round up, is China uses a bilateral approach in engaging African countries. So when they engage Africa, they will say China, Africa, so FOCAC, right? So it's China on one hand, and then Africa on one hand. So there's this bilateral concept. So if you come, you sit together here, you are Africa, I'm China. But if, again, it applies the same bilateral mode when it is engaging countries. And this is where the game gets interesting. So the president of Zimbabwe, when he gets into a room with Xi, is negotiating for Zimbabwe, right? And when he gets out, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, is waiting outside. So they don't know what they've got from China. There is no platform that is available where African countries will sit and decide on a joint program to negotiate with China or with the other countries. So that is the challenge that we have on a bigger scale. But lastly, on the point of imposition of these structures by China, we should also remember that there's a give and take. So our elites, they are also to blame if this relationship, because for China, looking at this power play matrix, China is doing what powerful countries do. They have in their toolkit resources. But remember, China is not competing with African states. It's competing within this hegemonic order of the US, right? And it is marshalling resources to compete with America, so that at some point, because it will come at some point, that the investment that it is doing will, it will get a return on it. So it is African states themselves who need to come to the party. Thanks.
I have a question about the construction of these parliaments and the funding of that. In my experience in Mozambique, the Chinese are building a new highway, and all of the money is going to Chinese workers, Chinese companies, and all of that. And the only local jobs are the two local guys waving the flags before and after to make sure that the traffic doesn't hit the construction. So how much local funding, or how much funding actually goes to the local communities? Because you said the maintenance is done by Chinese constructors. So yes, maybe this parliament costs millions, but all that money is going straight back into China. It's not really going into the local area, except for the buildings that stay afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, in Mozambique, I think Mozambique was one of the first countries to benefit from these parliament buildings. In 1999, China constructed that parliament building in Mozambique. Now, to your question, let me give you an anecdote of Lesotho. So, this Department of Aid Coordination that I spoke about, it reports to Parliament about the amount of donor aid that comes into the country. So they tell me this interesting story, that when they went to report to Parliament, they had all these donors, Japan, and then they went and said, China, new Parliament building. They put a 0. So parliamentarians were like, why are you saying? They're saying this is 0, like 0, no cent, 0 here. But we see the building, there it is, there. Then in their defense, they say, yeah, the building is there, but we don't know how much it costs, so we can't put, because there's nothing that has that flows into the system for other donors. Japanese, the money goes and gets into treasury, and then they can trace it, and then they can quantify how much it is, right? So even if it is saying it's 50 million, it's 50 million is a drawdown. You only sign papers, the money, because the contractors are in China. That's where the material comes from. And possibly the flows that come is money that pays directly to the employees, right? To the what do they call it? To the artisans, right? That actually construct it. So there is very limited flow of. I talk about it, in one of my articles, that the financial component. There's this idea that it doesn't. It doesn't flow. But having said this, because it might mean if this is bad, also which means the other model that is preferred by Western donors is good, because the Western donors, they say you have to advertise, you call for tender, right? It sounds all nice and sophisticated, but guess what? The money does the same thing. It flows back to the same big boys, because the same big boys were able to put together these big bids. So at the end of the day, the money goes where it's coming from. And as I say, probably another conversation about Africa, how it positions itself within the international space.
Sharp and soft power, because there seems to be a lot of hypocrisy in double standards in the Western circle with that. But my question is to do with the quality of construction standards in Malawi and Parliament, and to what extent do you think that's a concern for Chinese investment in Malawi and also the continent at large? So there seems to be quite a bit of, again, Western media criticism over the quality of Belt and Road Initiative projects and maybe their longevity. So do you think that's a concern for the future in terms of Chinese investment?
Yeah. Thank you. That's quite interesting. So let me see. So there is a, let me tell you the story. When I got on field work, first day when I got to Lilongwe, before I got authority to get into proper field work, I was walking around. I met this guy at the statue of mausoleum, or Kamuzu Banda's mausoleum. So I was speaking to him about what I'm coming there to do. Then he said something which is relevant to what you're saying about. He says, you know what? We call this a China label. It's an example of a China label. They're like, okay, what's a China label? Then a China label is something that looks good, but that is not really good, right? When you look at it closer, it's a good shirt, but not a really good shirt. Wait one. So they say there's lingo in Lilongwe. And it might explain the building is shiny. It looks good from outside. But from what I said, the dome looks like a sieve, right? But also it's not the dome problem. So the printing press is downstairs, and the guys that work in the printing press donated by Japanese, the actual machines. And they work in a dungeon. They have to be given milk, a pint of milk every day to do their work because of the fumes. But unfortunately, I interviewed guys working in the Hansard. So the Hansard guys work same space, but no milk. Anyway, that's another story. So it shows that the building is a China label in the context of that friend of mine, looking quite good, but not very good. But then, does that mean that it was intentional? Maybe it was. Because I've seen that the way in which these buildings are done has created this facility for maintenance. There are other examples, for example, in Lesotho that we can mention. So it might be that the buildings were built like this to be flawed in the first place because there was an option to use other means. So coming back to the story about China's concern. So for me, it's not about saying China, investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, probably there could be other alternatives. There are no alternatives. That's the challenge that we have. There is no alternative. So the West, for example, says, China is doing this. But say, you guys, you have been there for 100 years. What have you been doing, right? So China provides alternatives, bad alternatives, probably the only alternatives that are available, right? So that's, again, coming back to this idea of looking at what China is doing, not so great, but it's power play. They're playing, power games of big states, and probably the detriment of African states. But maybe because our elites are cued in on board, so it's not as bad as it sounds.
I remember you mentioned you also interviewed or engaged with the local ordinary people there.
Yep.
Could you say a bit about the perception of the local ordinary people when they compare Chinese aid and the traditional Western power donors, and how do they perceive them, and how do they feel?
Okay, probably. Thanks for that question. Probably I'll say 2 or 3 things in that. So the first one is, when they look at the buildings, they like the buildings, but sometimes they don't like the story behind the buildings, because there's a sense of what I said earlier about what's in it for China, why are they doing it, and also they then project, again, some, not all of them, they project their attitude towards the ruling elites, because they think that these ruling elites, they connive with outsiders to the benefit of the elites rather than the ordinary people. So they talk about, okay, why, for example, in Zimbabwe, they say, why would our elites agree for a parliament donation instead of a hospital, for example. So someone said, they said, like, why not?
Because this doesn't directly benefit the people.
Yeah, so they also say, why not a hospital? So I'll get those kinds of views about it. I'm not sure about the comparison because probably it was not outside. I mean, it was outside my scope in terms of comparing, Western aid to Chinese aid. But the closest that I came to was in Malawi, where a person at a focus group meeting explained to me that, you see, this building is not so strong. This building will collapse soon. But you see, compared to the government complex, which was built by the Germans, it is still going strong, right? So that was the closest where I came to this kind of comparison of, Chinese, products, and Western, donor aid in terms of, okay, this, yeah. So that's what I found.
Yes. I think it might be the last one.
With the pressure. Thank you for the presentation. It's fantastic. I wanted to ask you, there's two things probably in the presentation. One is very much about the parliament, but the other is about the scale of building or designing 15 parliaments at the same time. And I guess it's speaking of, this is my presumption, is speaking about some sort of inertia, some sort of structure. And I'm thinking of an architecture office that is doing this, what is doing that knows how to do that. You speak all the time about the Chinese in a very abstract way. And I wonder how much you can explain about those networks of architecture office. Is it very centralized? I was speaking about a school of architecture somewhere in Shanghai that from the network of practitioners that think about this in a way to frame it a little bit closer and try to think. Okay, I have more questions, but I'll leave it there. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I thank you for that. And it allows me to actually say a few things about. I understand that when I say the Chinese, it was a shorthand for me, because there are many actors, and there's, again, in the literature, when you say China has done this, it presents this homogeneous idea of China. What others will say, China Incorporated or China, so this big thing is China, but there are many actors involved. But for this study, it was very easy for me because it was China, the state, that is at the center, right? That is driving this thing. And how does it do this? So in the case of how these projects are done, the Minister of Commerce, right? Not the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is the heartbeat of these projects. And then the Minister of Commerce is the one, for example, that hires the architects. So these are architectural firms. For example, one example is in Zimbabwe, it was designed by the Beijing Institute for Architectural Redesign, right? So they hire architects. They also hire contractors, companies. So in the case of Zimbabwe, they hired Shanghai Construction Group, which is a private firm, but with links to Shanghai, the provincial government. In the case of Malawi, they hired a firm called the Anhui Foreign Economic Construction Company, which is also a private company, but with links to the Anhui province. And then, so there are these companies involved, but there are also smaller companies involved, that supply stuff. I'll just give you an example. So in Zimbabwe, when the parliament was being done, they said, okay, the parliament said, we have members of parliament who are asthmatic. So when you design it, you see, this is the Zimbabwe Parliament, the debate chamber. So they say, we want tiles, not carpet, right? Seems like a very simple thing to do, right? But the Chinese insisted, no, carpet it is. When I dug further, I realized that the value chain, so the smaller companies that supply carpet What do you tell them? Do you tell them, no, there's no more carpet? So there's this whole value chain. So from the Chinese state, you can map the hectares that are involved. And finally, you said something about the buildings being constructed at the same time, and probably my answer is maybe not. So you find that it's not like, this is like a subtle way, because they don't do like, okay, want to construct 10 buildings. So the buildings are incremental, you just see them. Now, for example, they are finishing the one in Congo, Brazzaville. So they just do it in incremental terms. They want to refurbish the one in Gabon, in Libreville. So they do it in incremental way, but when you assemble it, you realize that this is a massive scale.
And I noticed that the carpet actually looks like tiles.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, IB. Before I thank you properly and invite you all to thank IB, I just want to draw your attention to our two final events. One is tomorrow, which is a chance to meet the curators and the designers, the three African-based designers who put the building exhibition together. There's a guided talk, 3:30 to 4:30, and then there's a roundtable discussion between the designers and the curators, 5 o'clock in this room tomorrow. You're all very welcome. And after so drinks and better. And then on Tuesday we have our final speaker, who is Kuka Mantle, who is another member of the project, who's going to be speaking about her research on building the nation and constructing class, the architecture of education in Ghana. And that's going to be on Tuesday the 12th, that's next week, 5 o'clock in this room. Again, you're all welcome. I've left some leaflets inside of our and you can look up the details of these two talks and other events and get the questions. Let me thank IB for a fantastic talk, very stimulating.
Thank you.